Across the chamber, a figure captured his attention, a sturdy, road-weary dwarf with unmistakable royal presence, even if his cloak showed wear and his boots were caked in mud. That face. Yes, he recognized that face. Thrain's son, Thorin. In an instant, Gandalf recalled the tormented dwarf captive he'd discovered in Dol Guldur. The one whose spirit had been broken, whose form displayed marks of terrible suffering. The one who had entrusted him with a map and a key and a purpose. Find my son. He'd never learned that dwarf's name. Until this moment. Seated right before him was none other than Thorin Oakenshield, descendant of Durin's bloodline. But even as Gandalf connected the pieces, threat was drawing near. A pair of brutish men stood from the distant wall, clearly evaluating the dwarf. With the kind of gaze that guaranteed more than simple trouble. Paid watchers without question. Thorin set down his fork, one hand moving toward his sword's grip. Tension grew thick. Then, mind if I sit with you? The voice sliced through the moment, like sunlight-piercing storm clouds. Thorin glanced up to see an elderly man in gray robes, happily settling himself down opposite him. The two ruffians paused, exchanged a look, then slowly retreated into the darkness, cautious now. I'm Gandalf, Gandalf the Grey, the elderly man said, smiling beneath his broad-brimmed hat. I know who you are. Thorin's tone was careful, but not hostile. Well, that simplifies things, Gandalf said cheerfully. And what brings Thorin Oakenshield to Bree, if I may inquire? Thorin released a weary sigh. I heard whispers that my father was spotted wandering the wilderness, near the shadowed territories. I went searching, found nothing. Ah, Thrain. Gandalf breathed out, his expression briefly solemn. And so, without ceremony, the great wheel of destiny began turning once more. Chapter 48, The Invitation to the Expedition. Our meeting wasn't by accident, was it, Gandalf? Of course not, the wizard responded seriously. Gandalf's voice lowered, thoughtful and concerned. The matter of the Lonely Mountain weighs greatly on my thoughts, Thorin. That dragon has rested atop its gold treasure for far too long. It's only a matter of time before his existence attracts darker powers. The Lonely Mountain wasn't merely a lost realm, it was a stronghold. A barrier between the tranquility of the Western territories and the corruption spreading from the north. If that fortress falls into evil's grasp, Gandalf continued, they'll have a direct route through the mountain passes. Straight to Angmar, and if Angmar rises again. He didn't need to continue. Even a mention of the Witch King's domain returning chilled the blood. They'd circumvent our southern defenses entirely, Gandalf said. Places like Lothlorien, Rivendell, even the peaceful hills of the Shire, would no longer be beyond reach. And Gondor and Rohan, they would be battling with foes at the gates and daggers at their backs. The fall of one is the fall of all, Thorin murmured, nodding gravely. I encountered a few fools on the Greenway who mistook me for a vagrant, Gandalf added with a snort. They didn't fare particularly well, I assure you. Thorin gave a dry laugh. He knew better than most not to undervalue wizards. Gandalf produced a thick piece of parchment from his robes. I found this on one of them, a bounty. A bounty for what? For your head, Gandalf said plainly. Someone wants you deceased, Thorin. The atmosphere between them turned heavy. We can't afford to delay any longer. You're the heir to the throne of Durin. Unite the dwarven clans, gather their forces, and you can retake Erebor. Call a council of the 7 houses, Thorin's brow creased. That's only feasible if I possess the king's gem. The Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, the legendary jewel lost when Smaug claimed the mountain as his den. It was seized by the dragon, Thorin said. Without it, I can't rally them, they won't acknowledge my claim. Gandalf's eyes flicked toward 2 lingering observers, and with a sharp glare, he silently dismissed them from the chamber. Once they were gone, he turned back to Thorin. And if I told you, I could retrieve it. Thorin's brows lifted. You'd steal from Smaug from beneath his belly. Gandalf's eyes sparkled. Precisely, that's why we'll need a burglar. Something stirred in the wizard's chest. A certainty, a hunch only a wizard could rely upon. They needed a hobbit, a small one, quick on their feet, quiet. Practically invisible when they chose to be. Born to sneak. He had just the individual in mind. And one more companion, Gandalf said, puffing his pipe, a warrior he might be interested. Somehow he knew Eric would be. The plan, though still half-formed, was beginning to take form. Without delay, Thorin and Gandalf departed for the Blue Mountains to gather allies and complete the expedition. Thorin, freshly returned from the shadowed wilderness of the eastern hills. And Gandalf, ever traveling, once more took to the road together. By April, their preparations were nearly finished. "I must visit an old friend before we assemble in the Shire," Gandalf said, standing at the gates. "I'll leave a mark on the door." He departed swiftly, and not long after, Thorin and 12 stout-hearted dwarves answered the summons, donning their armor and setting off on the same path. April 3rd, age 2941, Roadside Fortress. Gandalf stood on a grassy elevation, leaning on his staff and peering into the sprawling land ahead. With narrowed eyes. "Is this still supposed to be the roadside fortress?" he muttered. "Doesn't resemble any roadside I've seen." Even from a distance, the towering walls were covered in green vines, and glimpses of polished stone and crafted terraces peeked through. A far cry from the wild, untamed ruins he remembered. A figure waved to him from the battlements. Gandalf waved back with a smile, tapping his staff against the earth twice in greeting. Up on the wall, Eric pulled a lever, swinging open the iron gate. His feet were clad in enchanted netherite boots, glowing faintly with featherfall runes. But the rest of him was dressed like a man on a lazy day in the garden. "Gandalf," Eric shouted, "good to see you. Things have been, well, surprisingly fast-paced lately." "Fast-paced?" Gandalf's eyes sparkled with amusement. "You look like you've just returned from a lakeside picnic." Eric laughed, "Only in appearance. My fingers feel like they've mined a dozen mountains." As Gandalf stepped through the gates, his eyes expanded. "By the Valor, this isn't a stronghold anymore. It's a blooming elven garden." "I did borrow some inspiration from Rivendell," Eric acknowledged. "You don't say," Gandalf responded, craning his neck to examine a terrace filled with hanging lanterns and creeping ivy. "If I didn't know better, I'd think Elrond constructed this place himself." "I've been doing some light renovations," Eric said humbly. "Light, he says," Gandalf scoffed, raising an eyebrow. "You've constructed a city, Eric." The wizard was guided inside, and soon found himself seated at a long wooden table. Eric, ever the considerate host, had personally cooked, using actual ingredients, not just conjured stew. As they ate, the two exchanged stories. Gandalf spoke of his travels through the Shire, his encounter with bumbling bandits on the Greenway, and the growing problem of vagabonds across Eriador. "Vagabonds, huh?" Eric frowned thoughtfully. "You wouldn't happen to know someone named Farad'n, would you?" "He used to pass by here, haven't seen him in ages." "Farad'n, can't say I do," Gandalf said, shaking his head. "I've met many people, but not every soul in Middle-earth." "I figured," Eric said. "Just curious, he's probably fine, spry enough to avoid trouble." "Let's hope so." The conversation paused long enough for Gandalf to finish off the last bite on his plate. Then, wiping his beard, he leaned forward. "Actually, I came here for a reason. I was wondering if you'd be interested in joining an expedition." Eric blinked, a slow smile forming. I thought it was about time. Wizards never drop by for tea." "Well," Gandalf's eyes gleamed with mischief, "shall I tell you about this little adventure of ours?" Eric folded his arms, leaning back in his chair. "I'm listening." Chapter 49, The Banquet. The so-called expedition naturally referred to the Erebor quest. It wasn't long before Gandalf shared everything that had occurred in Bree, including his encounter with Thorin Oakenshield and growing concerns about the strategic risks tied to Erebor. He spoke freely, whether or not Eric fully grasped the details. Clearly, Gandalf saw Eric as one of his own. That was the only reason he'd lay out the entire situation so openly. "Thorin, son of Thrain, heir to the throne of Durin's folk, is already marching eastward from the Blue Mountains," Gandalf explained. "He's gathered a band of dwarves and plans to meet at a place near the borderlands. A village called Bywater. From there, we depart for the Lonely Mountain to reclaim the Arkenstone." With the Arkenstone in his possession, Gandalf added, Thorin can rally the dwarven hosts and launch an assault on the dragon. If all goes well, Erebor will be ours again. Eric simply said, sounds like a decent plan. Indeed, that was the original idea behind the Erebor expedition. It was just that, well, the results had been less than perfect, historically speaking. Gandalf nodded, continuing with a twinkle in his eye. You may have heard that Smaug sleeps atop a mountain of gold. The treasure hoard beneath Erebor's halls is so vast, it gleams like a second sun, uncountable. Join the quest, help the dwarves reclaim their home, the wizard offered. And 15% of that treasure will be yours. Gandalf had done his homework. He knew Eric wasn't just some random wanderer. The man had a stronghold, some followers, and likely more to come. He wasn't someone who acted without purpose, though at times, he did show a peculiar habit of helping others. Simply for the sake of good. Still, even idealists needed provisions and coin. As for Gandalf himself, he never counted himself in any reward. For him, stopping evil was the reward. Eric nodded, I'm in. Only then did Gandalf exhale, visibly relieved. Having Eric's power behind this expedition made the whole endeavor far more secure. Excellent, Gandalf said quickly, as though worried Eric might change his mind. April the 25th, evening, we meet at Bag End in Hobbiton. Don't worry about directions, I'll mark the door myself. There'll be a banquet. Got it, Eric said with a chuckle. Looking at Gandalf's smug expression, the one that said he'd already arranged everything. Eric couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Bilbo. The poor hobbit had no idea what chaos was headed his way. Still, it was a little funny. While Gandalf departed immediately for the Shire, Eric stayed behind to prepare. He cleaned out his pack, tossing spare bricks and leftover building materials into his storage vault, making room for more essential travel gear. He packed golden apples, emergency potions, lembas bread, rations for weeks, hay blocks for his horse, spare armor, tools, enchanted weapons, arrows, and a well-balanced set of utility items for all possible survival scenarios. By the time he was done, his inventory grid was nearly full. 2 days later, after inspecting his territory and setting up basic auto defenses, Eric finally saddled up and rode out. He took it slow. The last thing he wanted was to accidentally arrive before Gandalf and ruin the wizard's dramatic entrance. A few days later, a sunny morning. The Shire Hobbiton. Good morning. Bilbo Baggins puffed gently on his pipe, offering a polite nod to the peculiar old man standing at his doorstep. What do you mean by that? The old man narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Do you wish me a good morning, or do you mean it is a good morning? Or perhaps you're just stating that it could be a good morning, whether I want it or not. All of the above, I suppose, Bilbo replied, brow furrowed. Something about this fellow was definitely odd. He was disrupting a perfectly peaceful morning and playing word games to boot. Bilbo silently hoped the man would get on with his business and go away. I'm looking for someone to join an adventure, the man said. Adventure? Bilbo blinked. Oh, this was that sort of person, probably one of Eric's acquaintances. They were all a bit strange, frankly. From Bree heading west, I doubt you'll find many who enjoy adventures, Bilbo said dryly. You're in the wrong place, but I do have a friend who might suit your needs, though I assure you, it's not me. Good morning to you, he added hastily, trying to close the door. But Gandalf wasn't finished. You do know me, he said, tapping his staff against the ground. You just haven't matched the name to the face. I am Gandalf. You've changed, Bilbo Baggins. You were different as a child, much more interesting. Well then, he said with finality, it's settled. With that, Bilbo slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. Clunk. Let's see you talk your way past that, he muttered. But then... Zzzzzz. Gandalf's staff traced a glowing rune, a stylized letter into the wooden door, the magic seeping into the grain. Bilbo's peaceful day had just begun to unravel. That evening, Bilbo had just pan-fried a lovely fish when... Knock knock. Dwalin, at your service. Ah, Bilbo Baggins, at yours, Bilbo replied, flustered, straightening his waistcoat. To his astonishment, Dwalin strode in and immediately helped himself to Bilbo's dinner. I wasn't really expecting company tonight. Ding dong. Balin, at your service. Then, Philly and Killy, at your service. You must be Mr. Baggins, one said cheerfully. No, you've made a mistake. Bilbo began to panic. That's my mother's hope chest, please don't put your muddy boots on it. Too late. Nice sword you've got, one dwarf commented, unsheathing it. Dwarven craftsmanship, exquisite quality. Swish, swish. The steel gleamed as he tested its weight, causing Bilbo to backpedal in horror. Hey, hands off, that was a gift from Eric, put it back. Eric, another dwarf murmured, that name rings a bell. Ding dong. Bilbo opened the door again, and immediately regretted it. A tide of dwarves surged in like a flood. Bilbo had no time to react before the hallway was packed. Behind them, the old wizard peeked in through the doorway with a smug grin. Gandalf, Bilbo groaned. A raucous banquet soon filled Bag End, his pantry emptied at terrifying speed. While the dwarves sang rowdy songs about smashing crockery and ruining carpets, Bilbo nearly fainted from stress. There's still one more, a dwarf remarked mid-verse. No, two, Gandalf said, eyes fixed on the door. He will come, won't he? Just then. Ding dong. Everyone froze, then slowly turned to Bilbo. You're the host, someone prompted. Bilbo sighed, all right, but if it's another bizarre guest. Kriog. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped through, draped in bloodied linen, clad in black steel armor. The air seemed to darken around him as he moved, his boots heavy, his presence immense. He looked like someone who had walked out of a battlefield, or maybe straight into one. Instantly, the dwarves jumped up. One grabbed a chair, another reached for a blade. Someone pulled a fork from the drawer like it was a weapon, another tried to haul Bilbo behind him. Combat reflexes all around. All except for Bilbo. Eric, Bilbo's face lit up like a lantern, arms open wide, he grinned from ear to ear. Oh, this is the best surprise all day. Welcome, welcome. I didn't think you'd actually come visit, though, well, as you can see. He turned to introduce everyone, only to find his home on the edge of a bar brawl. What are you all doing? Chapter 50, Joining. All right, put the weapons down. Bomber, Dwalin, forks and spoons are not swords and shields. And Boffer, that flute of yours might charm a bird, but I doubt it'll dent his armor. Gandalf moved swiftly around the room, soothing the dwarves like a teacher, calming unruly children. Thorin, however, hadn't so much as flinched. Ever the calm center of the storm, the dwarven prince simply sat there. His piercing gaze fixed on Eric from the moment he stepped through the door. The scent on him was unmistakable. Orc blood. So this is the powerful companion you mentioned, Thorin asked, voice low. Indeed, Gandalf replied, nodding gravely. He'll be a great asset to our journey. I vouch for him with my name. Eric exchanged a quick greeting with Bilbo before turning to Thorin. Well met. Thorin narrowed his eyes, thinking, we've met before, haven't we? Briefly, Eric said. In the Blue Mountains at the Forge Hall, I came through on my travels. Wait a minute, piped up a dwarf from the corner. Are you that human who stayed at the inn near the southern gate last winter? Eric smiled and nodded, offering warm greetings to the gathered dwarves. Another dwarf suddenly blurted. Hang on, I heard about a human who outdrank Bregni, the stoutest alehound in 3 valleys. That can't be true. You're telling me this guy outdrank a dwarf, pull the other one. I'm serious, said someone else, half the tavern was there. The room fell into stunned silence. I don't buy it, one dwarf muttered, not unless he drinks with me. A chorus of laughter and taunts broke out. All right, that's enough, Gandalf cut in, trying to regain control. We've more pressing matters at hand. He turned to Eric, his expression thoughtful. You reek of blood, trouble on the road. Eric nodded. Nothing serious, a few orcs and a pack of wargs decided to get brave. They attacked you, Gandalf raised a brow. Beasts like those don't need much reason, grumbled a dwarf. The dwarves hadn't heard the rumors. At least, not yet. The Anduin Valley was a long way from the Blue Mountains. Word traveled slowly. But Eric's deeds would eventually ripple across Middle-earth. These ones were different, Eric added. Organized, better armed, looked like someone was leading them, someone smart. Didn't matter, I wiped them out. Their wargs scattered in every direction, but my horse was faster. Gandalf nodded, unsurprised by Eric's blunt recounting. The dwarves, however, exchanged skeptical looks, a few murmured doubts. He might look the part, but surely no one could be that formidable. Bilbo, on the other hand, was completely lost. Orcs, wargs. He didn't understand half of what had been said, but he did understand one thing. "Ah, so you two do know each other," he muttered, glancing between Gandalf and Eric. "Of course you do." The moment passed, and Bilbo, ever the polite host, fetched Eric a stool so he could join the crowded table. Now the table was packed, shoulder to shoulder. Eric had at least gotten a seat. Bilbo had to stand on tiptoes behind Thorin just to see the map. "We must seize this opportunity," Thorin declared, pounding the table. "Erebor will be ours again." "But there's no way in," Balin pointed out sensibly. "Not anymore." "Ah, my dear Balin," Gandalf said, bending down with a mysterious smile. From the folds of his robe, he drew a key and a weathered map. "Your father, Thrain, entrusted these to me for safekeeping, and now they're yours." Thorin took the key in both hands and clenched it tightly. "Where there is a key," he murmured, "there must be a door." "And where there's a door," Gandalf added, "there might be another way in." The dwarves leaned forward, in anticipation. "But even if we reach the mountain," Gandalf said cautiously, "recovering the Arkenstone will be no simple task. It will require cunning, silence, agility." "We'll need a burglar," someone muttered. As one, every head turned toward Bilbo. Bilbo froze. He had never stolen anything in his life. The very idea was preposterous. And within seconds, the room erupted into a storm of laughter, objections, and loud disagreement. "Enough," Gandalf boomed, rising to his full height, staff clutched tightly. The air shuddered with magical pressure. Silence fell instantly. Only Thorin and Eric seemed unaffected. Thorin, because he was a king in exile, Eric, because, well, he thought the dramatic flair was impressive. "I say Bilbo Baggins is our burglar," Gandalf declared, "and so he shall be. Give him the contract." Bilbo was handed a parchment so long it nearly unrolled across the floor. He squinted at the fine print. 1/15 seems fair." Thud. A dwarf jokingly shouted something about insurance and damages, and Bilbo promptly fainted. Later that night, Gandalf found Bilbo on the couch, staring at the ceiling in a daze. "Bilbo," he said gently, "I can't promise you'll come back, but if you do, nothing will ever be the same again." Bilbo thought about that, about the wizard's words, and about all the wild stories Eric had told during his last visit. He shook his head. "No, I'm not signing." Outside, the dwarves gathered at the gate. "That Eric fellow seems reliable," one said, "but that burglar." "Nothing's going our way," another muttered. "We're not even warriors, we're smiths and toy makers." Thorin stepped forward and raised his voice. "You may not be soldiers," he said, "but each of you answered my call. That alone makes you braver than most warriors. Loyalty, courage, that's all we need." Gandalf, watching quietly from the side, turned to Eric. "You can fight the dragon, can't you?" Eric looked sideways at him. "I don't know, I've never seen it, but if it comes to it, I'll try." The wizard didn't press further. He turned to Balin. "Leave a signed copy of the contract here, just in case." The next morning, a lone figure sprinted across Hobbiton, hair unkempt, contract in hand. Meanwhile, deep in the trees, Eric kept his horse to a slow trot to avoid leaving the others behind. The dwarves' sturdy ponies were reliable, but slow. "Hey, is that diamond armor on your horse?" a dwarf finally asked, unable to contain himself. "It is," Eric replied. "Very tough, comes in handy during battle." "Can I touch it?" "Go ahead." "By Durin's beard, do you know how long it would take to mine enough to make a full barding like this?" Just then, a voice called out. "Wait for me." Bilbo appeared, panting, waving the signed contract. The company let out a mix of groans and cheers. A few dwarves whistled. "Welcome to Thorin Oakenshield's company, Mr. Baggins," someone called out. Not long after, Bilbo was trotting beside Eric and Gandalf, grinning despite himself. "They made bets, you know," he whispered. "On whether I'd show up, most of them thought I wouldn't." "And what about you?" Eric asked. Clink! A small pouch of silver coins flew through the air, caught effortlessly by Gandalf. "I never had any doubts," the wizard said cheerfully. Another pouch came flying. Eric caught it one-handed. "I'm more than happy to include a hobbit named Bilbo in my next tale of adventure," he said with a grin. "Being part of a story," Bilbo murmured, smiling as he looked around. "It's a strange feeling, isn't it?" Chapter 51, The Roadside Fortress. Home lay behind, and the wide world ahead. For the first time in his life, young Bilbo Baggins had stepped beyond the borders of the Shire. That night sleep did not find him. He lay down for a bit but soon sat up again, restless and wide-eyed. He wasn't the only one awake. Gandalf leaned against a boulder, puffing on his pipe. While Eric stood on a nearby ledge, scanning the dark wilderness ahead, his silhouette was still, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Suddenly, Rag! Unfamiliar howls and unsettling sounds echoed from the distant mountain valleys. The night air seemed to tense with unease. "What was that noise?" Bilbo asked nervously. He had never seen an orc, let alone heard one before. The sudden ruckus roused several dwarves from sleep, including Thorin himself. "Orcs," said Philly grimly. "Nasty things, judging by that racket. There's at least a few dozen nearby." He glanced at Bilbo, who looked pale. "They're everywhere in the Wilderland. They love to strike at night, creeping in like shadows. Before you even realize it, gone, just like that." Bilbo gulped. "Everywhere." Gandalf, still calmly smoking, glanced sidelong at Eric up on the ridge and gave a subtle shake of his head. True, the lands had once swarmed with orcs. Now, things were a bit less certain. As the noises grew louder, more of the company stirred. Barlin began recounting tales of old battles and how Thorin earned his title Oakenshield, helping distract the hobbit from his growing anxiety. Meanwhile, deep in the woods where even moonlight dared not reach, a group of orc scouts observed the glow of the company's campfire from afar. "They're here," the squad leader growled. "The dwarf scum have been found." He dispatched a few orcs to trail them, and sent the rest racing off to deliver the message to their master. And then's boom. The storm came without warning. By morning, the travelers rode through the downpour, rain drenching cloaks and beards alike. "I say, Mr. Gandalf, can't you do something about this weather?" Bilbo grumbled. "When it stops raining, it stops," Gandalf replied unhelpfully. "If you want someone to argue with the clouds, you'll need a different wizard." "There are others?" Bilbo asked curiously. "Indeed," Gandalf replied, glancing toward Eric then hesitating. "5 of us in total, myself, Sarum in the White, Radagast the Brown, and 2 blue wizards. Whose names I doubt you'd remember even if I told you." He looked at Eric again. Bilbo noticed the glance this time and followed it. "What about you, Eric? Are you one of them?" Eric smiled. "Gandalf's quite right, I've nothing to add." "All right," Bilbo said, unconvinced. Gandalf carried on, speaking about Radagast, an eccentric who dabbled in herbs and tonics. Much like Eric's alchemy setup, but mostly for the sake of healing injured squirrels and singing to hedgehogs. Radagast lived deep in the woods, loved all creatures. Unless they were birthed from the shadows, like giant spiders or wargs, and considered every life sacred, sometimes to ridiculous degrees. Eventually, the rain eased. The company rested briefly before continuing their eastward journey. They crossed Bree, past the last signs of civilized life, and moved beyond the Weather Hills. On the way, Gandalf suddenly pointed ahead. "Ah, we're here. That's Eric's domain, Roadside Fortress." "His domain?" one of the dwarves asked, surprised. "You mean to say he's a lord?" That changed everything, a fellow lord traveling in secret, just like Thorin himself. "Well, you could say that," Gandalf said with a maddeningly vague smile, though not a typical one. "So we're near your home now, Eric?" Bilbo asked, intrigued. Usually, it was Eric who popped round to Bag End. He'd never imagined visiting Eric's home. "Yes," Eric replied, "not far off the main road." "Can we visit?" Bilbo asked, almost bouncing in his saddle. "I'd be delighted," Eric nodded. Bilbo turned to the others for support. "Well, since Eric offered, I don't see a problem," Gandalf said, floating forward like a cloud. The dwarves, already curious about their quiet companion, quickly agreed. Still, they waited for one final voice. Thorin. If the lord of the land welcomes us, Thorin said, meeting Eric's gaze, then we'll gladly accept. And should you ever journey to a dwarven hall, you'll have the same welcome. Then it's settled, said Eric. Let's head in, you're all welcome to rest and resupply here. What they weren't expecting was the fortress. Moments later, they stood before a massive gatehouse, jaws slowly dropping open. Towering walls stretched out of sight in both directions. Smooth stone, impeccable symmetry, no signs of time or weathering. This is your keep, one dwarf asked in awe. I've never even heard of a city this size out here. When did this get built? How did no one know? It's a marvel. More magnificent than any human city I've seen. And you haven't even seen Minas Tirith, Gandalf chuckled. But how do we get inside? Oi, open up, your lord's returned, one dwarf shouted at the silent ramparts. No need to yell, Gandalf advised, stepping forward with casual familiarity. There's no one manning the walls. He waited by the massive iron gates, clearly expecting something. Clank! Eric pulled a hidden lever, and the gates swung open with a low rumble. Welcome to my keep, he said. Rest as long as you like, you'll find no shortage of food, water, or comfort here. The company's packs and ponies were quickly stabled. The dwarves wandered the pristine stone streets, admiring the square architecture. Whoever built this really liked right angles. Which is oddly satisfying. The clean-cut corners and orderly design tugged at something deep in the dwarven soul. Oh, what's that? Someone pointed nervously. A massive iron golem clanked around the corner, patrolling the perimeter. One dwarf tried to prod it with his axe. Gandalf quickly intervened. Don't, that's a defensive construct. Eric built them to protect this place. Based on what I've seen, one of those could flatten 10 orcs without breaking stride. Or 10 dwarves, another muttered under his breath. You serious? They weren't convinced until one of the golems turned to approach them. It clanked forward on piston legs, towering above them, head swiveling unnaturally. The dwarves immediately huddled into a defensive knot. We're guests, invited guests, they cried in unison. The golem scratched its head. Then, from some hidden compartment, it pulled out a small red flower and handed it to the frontmost dwarf, Barlin. Everyone froze. Thank you, said Barlin, blinking. He accepted the flower with the solemnity of a knight receiving a medal. They're surprisingly polite, he added, as if the entire panic hadn't just happened. Another golem wandered over and handed another flower to a shorter dwarf. I agree, that dwarf nodded, pocketing it. Good height, too. All right, everyone, Eric called from inside the keep. Quit hugging golems, I've got lunch ready. The dwarves looked at one another. Lunch. Lunch, Bilbo echoed, his mind snapping into focus like a steel trap. He sprinted toward the hall. Wait for me, you said you cooked it yourself. Indeed he had, and that, for Bilbo Baggins, was the greatest miracle of all. Chapter 52, Dispute. Burp. With a loud burp, Bomber slumped sideways in his chair by the long banquet table and began to snore instantly. His plump face relaxed in blissful sleep. Oh dear, Gandalf shook his head wearily. Can someone help carry him to a bed? I told him not to eat that much. Old Balin chuckled, patting his own very round belly. Forgive us, Gandalf. I've never eaten food this good. Everything here is delightful. Gorgeous landscape, delicious meals, if only there were ale. He sighed wistfully. Had I known we'd feast like kings tonight, I would have spent every last silver coin in that village on barrels of strong drink. Around the table, the other dwarves were in similarly overstuffed states. Burps echoed like distant cannon fire. Even the more restrained among them looked ready to pop. The only one who managed to maintain any composure was Thorin, who, despite his steady chewing, hadn't once put his fork down. Noticing Gandalf sneaking glances at him, Thorin cleared his throat, paused, and said in his usual grave tone, I'll admit these dishes are masterfully prepared. Some of the methods used, I've never seen the like. Innovative and oddly refined. Then he gave a curt nod toward Eric. Thank you for your generous hospitality. After seeing the fortress with their own eyes, the dwarves' perception of Eric had shifted completely. He wasn't just some wandering knight, He was the lord of this stone fortress. A stronghold unlike any they'd seen in decades. Sure, the place seemed a bit empty. Suspiciously empty, really. Not a soul outside of Eric had been seen. But the man had built all this himself, apparently wielding some measure of magic as well. If he ever decided to call for settlers, it was easy to imagine people lining up to live here. When asked, Eric didn't deny his magical abilities either. Strictly speaking, much of what he'd built could reasonably be explained as magic, or at least something very close. The dwarves weren't fools, brash perhaps, but not stupid. And the moment they realized what kind of power Eric wielded, their tones shifted. "Eat as much as you like," Eric declared, grinning. "Don't you dare hold back on my account." Dwarves had legendary appetites, second only to hobbits. But even after stuffing themselves and packing extra food into their sacks, they barely made a dent in Eric's massive provisions. He'd been preparing stockpiles for months, and this feast was just a nibble off the top. "This is just the dry rations," he said casually, gesturing toward piles of dried meats, fruits, and loaves. The dwarves stared. "You call this dry rations?" When asked, mouth still full of smoked venison. Their own journey had been powered by cram, compact, tasteless travel bread. While nutritious and durable, cram had the culinary excitement of stale bark. Even the best prepared versions made you miss hunger. "I could eat this jerky every day for the rest of my life," one dwarf muttered dreamily. Full and content, the dwarves eventually began wandering the halls of Eric's fortress. It was vast, with no shortage of empty rooms, so most simply picked a chamber and collapsed into bed. That night passed peacefully. Oddly so. There was no howling in the woods, no rustling in the dark, no lingering sense of danger. Even in their dreams, the dwarves could sense how still everything was. Eric's land seemed untouched by the wild threats that plagued most of the world. On the top floor of the fortress, Gandalf stood by the window. His pipe glowing softly as the fire from his enchanted ring ignited the tobacco, he stared out across the moonlit hills, lost in thought. "The world's shape may be changing again," he muttered to himself. Wizards and certain powerful elves had a vague sensitivity to the currents of time. They could sometimes feel when the future began to shift. "You're not sleeping either, huh?" came a voice from behind. Eric strolled into the chamber, took a seat, and bit into a crisp apple before tossing another to Gandalf. The wizard caught it, wiped it with his sleeve, and took a bite. "Sweet, very sweet," he commented. "You might be right, maybe I should get some rest. The beds here have this magic about them. You lie down and it's morning before you know it." He paused. "What do you think about this quest?" Eric leaned back. "I think it'll work, we'll make it." Gandalf gave a thoughtful nod. "Let's hope so." By dawn, the dwarves had woken, refreshed and ready. They packed up their things, filled their bags with more of Eric's dry rations, and set out toward the east once more. The feast had bonded them with Eric. Several dwarves came over on the road to chat. "When you visit our halls, you'll see what true dwarven hospitality looks like," one promised. Roaring fires, hearty stew, songs that echo off stone, and barrels upon barrels of strong drink. "You'll be treated like kin." "I'm looking forward to it," Eric replied with a smile. "I'll hold you to it." As they marched on, they arrived at a familiar landmark, the last bridge. The ancient structure dated back to the First Age. Though the kingdom that originally built and maintained it had long since crumbled into legend. Rivendell had since taken up the responsibility of keeping it in repair. Thanks to their watchful eye, the bridge was still solid and safe to cross. "There used to be farms nearby," someone remarked. And indeed, past the bridge, they found the remains of a hamlet, burned-out homes, blackened stone, and silence. "Let's camp here for the night," Thorin ordered. Eric pulled out his map and slapped his forehead. "No wonder I couldn't find this place before. Last time I came through the forest looking for treasure, I entered from the west and cut straight east." This ruin, however, sat at the southern edge of the forest, completely outside his previous route. "I say we keep moving," Gandalf said, frowning as he surveyed the ruined homes. "This place isn't right." "What do you mean?" asked Eric. "There's no trace of a fight, no bodies, just gone." Gandalf appeared troubled. "The inhabitants here disappeared. That's never a good sign." We ought to head to Rivendell, he continued. The elves can provide food, refuge, and guidance, much like you have, Eric. Thorin approached gradually, his tone quiet yet resolute. I mentioned before, I won't take a single step toward that location. Why not? Gandalf asked firmly. They're not our foes, they could help. They observed our downfall, they allowed us to collapse, Thorin replied sharply. Let them retain their melodies and gentle phrases. I have no need for advice from those who remained idle, while Erebor was destroyed. Tension filled the atmosphere, Eric grimaced. I provided you that map and key so you'd utilize them, Gandalf stated, becoming agitated. Not so you could grip the past like a hound with a prize. I don't think they were yours to offer, Thorin responded coldly. A moment of quiet passed, Gandalf's face reddened. You thankless fool. He pivoted sharply and marched away. Gandalf, where are you headed? Bilbo shouted anxiously. To the only rational individual within 10 miles. Who's that? Myself. I've experienced enough dwarf conflict for an entire existence. The sorcerer stopped abruptly. Eric, accompany me immediately. Okay. Eric offered Bilbo a comforting gesture, then followed the irritated wizard into the woodland. Bilbo remained there uncomfortably, trapped between realms. Thorin didn't even look backward. Bomber, ignite the flames, we're staying here. Bilbo parted his lips, then closed them once more. Truthfully, he couldn't fault Gandalf for his actions. He was beginning to believe the sorcerer had made the correct choice. Chapter 53, a famous landmark. Elsewhere, the two had traveled quite a stretch, when Gandalf eventually calmed sufficiently to talk. We have no alternative, Eric. Whether those dwarves consent or not, we must visit Rivendell. The lunar inscriptions on that chart can only be interpreted by Elrond, the ruler of the Vale. Without his assistance, we'll never finish this quest. We'll require the elves' aid. He stopped, then glanced over. Eric, when the moment arrives, I want you to assist me in persuading them, however you deem appropriate. Eric nodded readily. If that's what's necessary, I'll do it. But where are we traveling now? Aren't we returning? Eric inquired, gazing up at the dimming heavens. Gandalf paused before answering. I'm not entirely prepared to encounter any more dwarves tonight. You proceed ahead, I'll explore forward a bit longer, then rejoin you. Eric lifted an eyebrow but shrugged. All right. Obviously, the elderly wizard was still brooding. Spinning on his heel, Eric made his way back toward the encampment. Back at the destroyed shelter, Bilbo was transporting 2 hot bowls of broth. He intended to deliver them to Killy and Filly. But when he arrived, the 2 dwarves stood motionless, gazing at something. What's the matter? We're lacking 2 steeds, Filly stated grimly. There were 17, now only 15 remain. Apart from the 15 utilized for transportation, the other 2 had been pack animals, carrying equipment and provisions. Should we inform Thorin? Bilbo questioned. Not yet, Killy answered, wincing. He'll become concerned, and you understand how he responds. Also, Filly added with a breath. Eric's unusual-looking mount is missing too. That particular one was loaded with half the group's camping supplies and a mysteriously weighty container. If they didn't retrieve it, they faced serious difficulty. You're meant to be a thief, aren't you? Killy turned toward Bilbo. Help us solve this mystery. Resigned, Bilbo placed down the bowls and started examining the surroundings. These trees, they've been torn from the ground, he whispered nervously. He crouched beside a fallen oak. What could possibly possess the power to extract a tree from the soil like a plant? I concur, Killy murmured, focusing his gaze. Wait, what's that in the distance? Dim flickers of orange danced far away. Is that firelight? Trolls, Killy declared grimly. He turned toward Bilbo, completely serious. Time to demonstrate your skills, Mr. Baggins. Mountain trolls are sluggish and simple-minded. You're small, they won't notice your approach. Me? Oh no, absolutely not. Don't fret, we'll be directly behind you. And with that declaration, Bilbo was promptly pushed from the bushes with a squeak. Fine, he grumbled, brushing himself off. Fine, I'll do it. But Killy and Filly weren't completely reckless. While Bilbo approached the flames, they quietly rushed away to notify the others. A brief while later, the entire company of dwarves crouched behind the vegetation. They anxiously observed Bilbo's every action. Until he was discovered. A troll seized him like a toy and lifted him into the atmosphere. Any companions hiding close by, little vermin? No, Bilbo stated firmly. Deceiver. I said no. Even dangling inverted by his ankle, Bilbo refused to betray the others. That was sufficient for Killy. With a yell, he exploded from the bushes, blade in hand. Release him. Attack, Thorin roared, his voice like thunder as he commanded the assault. The dwarves surged forward as one entity, weapons swinging, their battle cries resonating through the trees. Though it was turbulent, there was a distinct rhythm to their offensive. Each dwarf moved in synchronization with the next, protecting each other, striking simultaneously. This was what made dwarves such a dreaded force in Middle-earth. Not size or power, but coordination and absolute determination. Accept this, you hideous monster. Clang! A war hammer crashed into a troll's cranium. But where it would have shattered a man's head like fruit, it only dislodged a few yellowed teeth. Their hide was absurdly dense, more mineral than flesh. Even the mightiest dwarf blows only managed to create shallow wounds or provoke pained howls. Still, the trolls were being exhausted. Gradually but steadily, they were losing position. Then catastrophe struck. Two trolls seized Bilbo by the limbs and legs. Lower your weapons, one bellowed. Or we tear him in half. All attention turned toward Thorin. He observed Bilbo, whose eyes were wide with terror. Then without hesitation, clang, he released his blade. The others followed his example. 13 dwarves, surrendering their sole opportunity at liberation, for the welfare of one hobbit. Now restrained and seated beside a bubbling cauldron, the dwarves muttered curses through clenched teeth. I'm not being transformed into broth by a bunch of oversized vegetables, Boffer hissed. We must hurry, one troll grunted. Dawn approaches, I refuse to become stone over some undercooked dwarf. That statement made Bilbo perk up. He stood, drawing their attention toward him. No, you're doing it incorrectly, he stammered nervously. Dwarves require being, skinned first. Yes, very crucial step. A chorus of horrified dwarves erupted behind him immediately. You what? You little. Thorin kicked the loudest offender to silence him. Bilbo ignored the outrage and continued improvising, attempting to buy time. He glanced around desperately for anything helpful. And then, movement caught his eye. A shadow atop a boulder appeared suddenly. A man clad in dark armor raised a finger to his lips. Stay quiet, the gesture meant. Then, in the blink of an eye, he leapt down swiftly. Thwack! A single strike landed with force. One troll howled in agony, clutching its burning side desperately. The mysterious warrior's blade had not only pierced its stony hide, it ignited it. The fire spread rapidly, the troll toppling and rolling in agony. The dwarves blinked in shock at the sight. A second troll lunged forward, and again, the black-armored figure struck. Another burst of flame erupted, another scream of pain followed. They have backup, a troll roared loudly. The third troll, however, was still on the move aggressively. It charged the armored figure, its massive fist raised like a battering ram. Behind you, Thorin yelled urgently. But Eric, yes it was Eric, only smiled calmly. He raised one hand confidently. Boom! The punch landed hard, but Eric didn't budge an inch. The earth cracked beneath him, but he stood tall, completely unfazed. What in the name of Moria? A dwarf whispered, slack-jawed. Eric's enchanted armor shimmered brilliantly under the moonlight. Forged from netherite alloy and enchanted with knockback resistance, it absorbed the blow completely. He deflected the next strike with a clean parry, then danced between the trolls. His movements showed uncanny precision and calculated timing. Each dodge was timed perfectly, every movement seemingly preordained by fate. It was like watching someone who knew the future. Though he could have easily bulldozed them with brute force, Eric moved with elegant efficiency. He used his old-world combat instincts to their fullest, almost showing off. He toyed with the enemy skillfully. "Slippery little worm," one troll bellowed angrily. But the cleverest of them paused, backing away with a trembling snort. He had seen this before, in stories whispered among trollkind, of a monster known only as Gold Gobbler. A spectral demon who hunted solitary trolls and ogres, then consumed their treasures. "No, no, you're the Gold Gobbler," the troll shrieked fearfully. He pointed at Eric with a shaking hand. The dwarves exchanged confused looks among themselves. "Gold what now?" whispered Ori quietly. Eric cocked his head curiously. "So that's what they're calling me." He flicked the blood from his blade casually. The trolls screamed in terror. "Run!" But before they could escape far. "Cracked! Let the dawn take you." Gandalf stood atop the boulder, staff raised high above. With a thunderous crack, the stones split apart dramatically. A blinding shaft of sunlight pierced through the forest canopy. The trolls froze mid-step instantly. Crackle followed. SHHHK echoed through the clearing. 3 towering statues now stood where the trolls had been before, still caught in the act of fleeing desperately. "Gandalf," Bilbo gasped in relief. The wizard scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Oh dear, looks like you didn't really need me after all." Chapter 54, The Hunt. "Oi, old man," Eric sheathed his sword with an exasperated sigh. "You really had to steal the kill when the troll was 1 hit away." Gandalf, as unapologetic as ever, leaned on his staff and grinned. "A wizard is never late, Eric, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when someone's about to get flattened." He gave the 3-stone troll statues a satisfied knock with his staff. The trolls had been mid-sprint when petrified by sunlight moments ago. Now they stood forever in some vaguely ridiculous poses, arms flailing awkwardly. Their eyes were wide with eternal terror. Gandalf seemed quite proud of his impromptu artwork display. "At least no one lost an arm this time," he remarked cheerfully. "We have Eric to thank for that," Thorin said, emerging from the rocky shadows. His expression was composed, as if their earlier squabble had never happened. "These trolls came from the Ettenmoors," Gandalf muttered seriously. His eyes narrowed as he examined the black ichor dripping from Eric's sword. "That's troubling news indeed." The Ettenmoors, a grim, desolate stretch of land bordering the Misty Mountains, wasn't pleasant. It wasn't exactly known for sunshine and picnics at all. It was a breeding ground for trolls, orcs, and all manner of unsavory things. If creatures from there were pushing this far south now. The last time trolls dared to travel this far, evil had its claws deep. Thorin murmured with concern. Eric and Gandalf exchanged a meaningful look between them. There was a hidden weight in their silence, something only they seemed to share. Perhaps, Eric thought grimly, Sauron wasn't quite as gone as everyone hoped. You could destroy his body, defeat him in battle, but evil had a way. It leaked back in, like mold behind a wall. The Dark Lord might have lost his ring, but that didn't mean he was gone. Gandalf, catching the flicker of doubt in Eric's eyes, shook his head. He turned his gaze to the nearby cliffs thoughtfully. "Trolls don't wander in daylight," he muttered with certainty. "There must be a cave nearby." Eric was already 10 steps ahead, literally speaking. He'd vaulted over a low ridge, torch in hand, and found a cave entrance. It was buzzing with flies and reeking of rot. "This way," he called out to the others. The dwarves followed quickly, most of them gagging as they approached. They clamped hands over their noses desperately. "Smells like something perished in here, then perished again," Boffer wheezed heavily. "Troll horde," Eric replied simply and directly. The cave opened into a large chamber, glittering with treasure everywhere. Gold coins, jeweled trinkets, and silver goblets lay scattered like dragon scales. They covered the floor completely. Chests overflowed with valuables, more than any of them could hope to carry. "Hit the jackpot," someone whispered in awe. A few dwarves immediately began burying the excess loot in makeshift holes. They grumbled about saving it for later as they worked. Meanwhile, Thorin picked up a pair of ancient swords from beneath cobwebs. "These weren't forged by troll hands," he said, frowning curiously. "Nor by any man," Gandalf agreed, taking one and inspecting it closely. These blades are from Gondolin, elven made, first age. Thorin, upon hearing elven, made a face like he'd tasted spoiled mead. He dropped the sword instantly in disgust. This, Gandalf continued with a faint smile, is the finest sword you'll ever hold. Thorin glanced down, muttered something about accursed irony, then promptly picked it back up. He slid it into his belt begrudgingly. Eric, meanwhile, studied the swords with narrowed eyes carefully. He recognized them at once without hesitation. Glamdring and Orcrist, twin blades of legend. Glamdring, once wielded by the High King of the Noldor, Turgon himself. Orcrist, its sister blade, forged to slay orcs by the dozens. "Mind if I take a look?" Eric asked politely. Without hesitation, Gandalf handed him Glamdring immediately. Thorin, after a short grumble, handed over Orcrist reluctantly. Glamdring, +9 attack. Orcrist, +9 attack. Just like Eric's own ancient blade, balanced, wickedly sharp, and pulsing faintly with enchantment. "They're fine swords," Eric said at last, "but not necessarily better than mine." With a flourish, he drew his own sword from its sheath. The moment it left its sheath, even in the dim cave light, it glinted. It shone like moonlight on frost brilliantly. If Glamdring was a fire, Eric's sword was a winter storm. "You could do worse," Gandalf admitted, taking his back carefully. Thorin, grumbling something about smug humans, did the same reluctantly. They carefully concealed the rest of the treasure in the cave securely. Then they prepared to move on swiftly. As they filed out, Gandalf noticed something shiny buried near the exit. It was a dagger, elven make and sharp enough to shave bark. He handed it to Bilbo gently. "Real courage," he told the hobbit gently, "isn't about knowing when to strike. It's knowing when not to." Suddenly, a cry rang out from outside. "Something's coming." Gandalf was outside in a flash, staff in hand ready. Bilbo stared at the dagger a moment longer, then dashed after him. It was a false alarm, thankfully enough. A brown-robed figure came loping into view atop a sled. The sled was pulled by rabbits the size of sheep. Radagast, Gandalf muttered, recognizing him. The eccentric wizard looked out of breath completely. "Gandalf, something's wrong in Greenwood," he said urgently with concern. "The spiders, they're growing in number, big ones, nasty ones. They're not normal, they're spawn of Ungoliant." The name made even Gandalf pale visibly. Ungoliant, one of the oldest evils known to exist. A monstrous spider, born of the void itself long ago. Gone now, or so the legend said hopefully. But her children still haunted the world endlessly. Shelob was one of them, and even Sauron had feared her. "I visited Dol Guldur," Radagast continued breathlessly. "It's worse than we thought, oh, and I found this." He pulled out a blade tightly, wrapped in cloth carefully. It was the Witch King of Angmar's sword itself. Gandalf stared at it, expression grave with concern. Howls shattered the air suddenly and violently. A warg lunged from the ridge aggressively. Eric met it mid-leap and cut it down in one stroke. But more came charging forward relentlessly. "A scouting party," Gandalf shouted loudly. "Which means a full pack is close behind." "We have to run," someone cried desperately. "The ponies," a dwarf sputtered anxiously. "They've all bolted, except Eric's." Bilbo sighed heavily at the situation. So much for making things easier today. "I'll draw them away," said Radagast determinedly. "I'll finish them off," said Eric confidently. They stared at each other briefly. "You'll never outrun Gundabad wargs," Gandalf warned the brown wizard seriously. "Oh, won't I?" Radagast smirked mischievously. "Let them try catching Roscoble hares." There was no more time to argue now. Moments later, the plain erupted into chaos completely. Eric rode like a thunderclap through the grass, slicing down wargs with terrifying precision. Half the pack chased him, howling in fury angrily. The other half went after Radagast, who zigzagged through the terrain wildly. He cackled as he went with delight. Gandalf led Thorin and the others through a hidden path carefully, though not without trouble along the way. "Forget the madman on the bunny sled," barked the orc captain chasing them. "Focus on the dwarves." With more wargs turning back toward Gandalf's group, the pressure mounted significantly. Behind a boulder, Boffer peeked out, watching Eric dismantle a pack of wargs. He handled them like it was a tavern brawl. "I take back everything I said," he murmured quietly. "He's not bluffing at all, that human's a menace." "Just be glad he's on our side," Gandalf muttered seriously. "Now move, there's a tunnel ahead." Chapter 55, The Sword Yet Unnamed. Swish! With a sweeping stroke, Eric's sword cleaved through yet another warg completely. It ignited its coarse fur in flames instantly. The beast let out a pained howl before collapsing, unmoving permanently. Riding atop his faithful warhorse, Eric chased down the scattering orcs relentlessly. He gave the dwarves behind him precious time to regroup safely. "Shoot the horse," bellowed the orc chieftain desperately. A group of orc archers fumbled to notch arrows hastily. They drew back their crude bows and aimed for the charging steed. But hitting a full-speed warhorse from a distance, they might as well try shooting the moon itself. Even if they somehow landed a shot, the most they'd achieve was minor damage. In fact, judging by the stacks of hay blocks Eric kept in his inventory, the beast could stand still and let them exhaust their quivers without worry. As for Eric himself, the occasional arrow barely made his health bar twitch. These days, common weapons barely registered against his defenses anymore. Hooves thundered across the plain loudly and powerfully. Eric cut down each fleeing warg with practiced ease, the fire-lit blade whistling. It moved with deadly rhythm and precision. Then a horn blew in the distance, familiar, noble, and clear. "Duum!" A battalion of elves clad in silver-gray armor thundered across the horizon. They hadn't yet engaged the orcs, but had already formed into battle lines. They were orderly and disciplined perfectly. What followed was more of a cleanup than a battle. The orc lieutenant tried shouting his warriors into formation desperately, but his voice was quickly drowned by the shrieks of dying orcs. "Retreat!" he screamed frantically and then promptly turned tail. He ran first without hesitation. He'd known this skirmish was a lost cause the moment that terrifying man joined. The plan was to stall Eric, eliminate the dwarves, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Too late for that now. Not only had they failed to eliminate anyone important, but now elven cavalry had joined. A company of elven cavalry had joined the fray decisively. Game over for them. Within minutes, the plains were emptied completely of enemies. Those orcs who hadn't been defeated or trampled had vanished into the hills. They howled in panic as they fled. Eric scanned the field carefully for any signs. Gandalf and the dwarves were nowhere in sight anywhere. He figured they'd already taken the hidden path into Rivendell. Once the orcs were cleared, the elven cavalry regrouped and trotted toward Eric. Their weapons were sheathed peacefully now. "Well, it's you again," said a familiar voice approaching. Lord Elrond rode forward, his hair silvered by moonlight beautifully. An amused smile played on his lips. "You've grown stronger since we last met," he said, slowing his horse beside Eric. "Rumors of your deeds have reached even my halls." "I'm honored," Eric replied politely, saluting with his blade respectfully. "I assure you, I didn't bring the orcs this time." "I was wondering about that," Elrond murmured thoughtfully. "They've been unusually active near our borders lately." Eric shrugged casually at the observation. "This time it's complicated, let's just say they're almost here." "They?" "Elsewhere, at the gates of Rivendell." "Mithrandir," said a tall elf descending the marble steps gracefully. He greeted the wizard with a bow. "Ah, Lindir," Gandalf greeted warmly in return. "I heard you crossed the ford of Bruinen," Lindir remarked in Elvish. "I must speak with Lord Elrond," said Gandalf, his tone turning serious. "He's not in the hall at the moment." "Not in," Gandalf frowned with confusion. "Where is he?" Before Lindir could answer properly, a horn rang out at the valley's entrance. A column of elven riders crossed the slender bridge in disciplined formation. "On guard," shouted the dwarves immediately. They quickly formed a protective circle around Bilbo, weapons drawn defensively. Suspicious eyes were fixed on the incoming elves warily. "Wait, is that Eric?" Bilbo squinted from the middle of the group. He scrambled to the front quickly. "Elrond," Gandalf greeted as the elven lord dismounted smoothly. "Gandalf," Elrond returned the nod courteously. Melanin, he greeted his old friend with the grace of the Eldar. After handing off his helm and sword to Lindir carefully, Elrond fell into conversation. He spoke with Gandalf, his brows furrowed in thought deeply. 3 orc raids in such a short time, it's unusual. Last time, they were drawn by a certain dangerous human, and this time. That would be us, Gandalf admitted honestly. Eric strolled over just then, casually handing his reins to a stable elf. You all know each other, Elrond arched an eyebrow curiously. He glanced between Gandalf and Eric questioningly. That's what I wanted to ask, Gandalf muttered drily. He stepped aside to present the dwarves formally. Allow me to introduce Thorin, son of Thrain. You and I have never met, Thorin said stiffly, staring up at the tall elf. Elrond studied him a moment before replying calmly. Your bearing reminds me of your grandfather. I knew Thror when he still ruled. He ruled beneath the mountain long ago. Really? Funny, he never mentioned you, Thorin replied coolly. Elrond took a slow breath, choosing diplomacy over pride wisely. He turned to an attendant and instructed in Elvish politely. Light the fires, prepare wine, see our guests are well treated. Did he just insult us in his tree speak? Gloin growled suspiciously. No, he's inviting us to dinner, Gandalf explained with a sigh. The dwarves huddled together, discussing quietly. Well, if food's involved, we can let that go, one muttered. They followed their hosts, albeit with the enthusiasm of people headed somewhere unpleasant. Later that evening arrived. The dwarves stared at the dining table in stunned silence. No meat, no stew, no roast at all. Just leaves, raw ones everywhere. Are they seriously eating this? This is what I feed my pony when I run out of oats. Eric's rations taste better than this, and they're compressed hay cakes. They grumbled, picking at their salads like children punished for misbehavior. Can we ask Eric to cook? Someone whispered hopefully. If he makes it, I'll eat grass willingly. At another table, Killy winked at a slender elf flirtatiously. I don't like elves, he said, but that one's kind of pretty. That's not a girl, someone muttered bluntly. PFFFD. Dwarf laughter exploded down the table loudly. Killy sank into his seat, face burning with embarrassment. Meanwhile, across the hall, Eric sat with Gandalf, Elrond, and Thorin at their table. They were discussing weapons, and Elrond was inspecting each blade in turn. Elven craftsmanship, he said, examining Thorin's sword carefully. Orcrist forged in the west by my kin, may it serve you well. Despite Thorin's earlier remarks, Elrond's voice carried no bitterness at all. Only genuine hope the blade would live up to its legend. Then Gandalf added, why not take a look at Eric's sword as well? He's been cutting down wargs and orcs left and right with that thing. Oh, this old piece. Eric grinned and unslung the weapon casually. You already looked at it last time. Even so, he handed it over willingly. Elrond took it in both hands, more carefully this time. He turned it over, eyes narrowing with interest. I can say with certainty, he murmured, that its craftsmanship rivals the finest blades. It rivals those of the First Age. He paused thoughtfully for a moment. And unless I'm mistaken, it has changed somehow. A faint glow pulsed from the blade's surface, barely visible unless observed closely. It radiates heat magic perhaps, it feels, sharper than before. As if the flames and blood of battle have awakened something dormant. He handed it back with a solemn nod. It may soon be time for you to name it. Eric blinked in surprise at the suggestion. A name, huh? He looked at the blade thoughtfully and felt his usual affliction creeping in. Chronic name indecisiveness was striking again. Meanwhile, under the table, Bilbo discreetly slid out his own short blade. He inspected it with new interest carefully. Balin leaned over curiously to observe. No offense, lad, but I'm not sure that even qualifies as a sword. More like a fancy letter opener. Bilbo sighed and quietly returned it to its sheath. The banquet ended peacefully, though the wine had received more praise than the food. The dwarves agreed on one thing unanimously. Even Eric's travel rations were better than Rivendell's salad bar offerings. Eric knew the elves had meat, of course. They'd served him venison before. On his last visit, he had enjoyed it. Tonight's vegetarian feast was a subtle act of diplomatic revenge. After all, you don't insult a host and expect roasted lamb in return. That night, under starlight shining brightly, Elrond knelt beside Gandalf and Thorin, reading the ancient moon runes carefully. He examined Thorin's map by firelight and elsewhere, Bilbo stood by a railing, staring at the breathtaking valley below. He was completely entranced by the view. Eric, meanwhile, was back at the stables, explaining to a very confused elf. No, the horse didn't need hay or apples at all. Just don't feed him, trust me. He was also asking about a Glanir, the elf who had once graciously hosted him. Eric had invited him to visit his fortress earlier. But judging by elven timekeeping, a Glanir probably thought Eric had only been gone briefly. Still, now that he was back, it wouldn't hurt to bring a small gift. A gift of thanks would be appropriate. Far away, atop Mount Gundabad high above, a battered orc captain crawled to a pale, muscular war chief desperately. "We lost the dwarves, master," he whimpered fearfully. "The elves ambushed us completely." Azog slowly turned, towering over the coward menacingly. "I don't want excuses," he growled dangerously. The smaller orc trembled with fear visibly. "They had help, a terrifying human. I barely escaped with my life." "Cracked." Azog seized him by the throat and lifted him effortlessly. "You'd have been better off perishing out there." With a swift motion, the orc's neck twisted sharply. Azog tossed the body aside, where it was quickly dragged off by hungry wargs. "Place a bounty on the dwarves," he snarled furiously. "I want their heads brought to me." "Arooiziarar." The orcs shrieked and scrambled onto their wargs, ready to spread out searching. Just before they rode, a scout crept forward cautiously. "Master, there's something else. We saw a city, big, quiet, east of here." Azog's eyes darkened with rage instantly. His clenched fist trembled with barely contained fury. "Stay away from it," he ordered firmly. He didn't need to ask whose city it was. Long ago, 2 orcs had returned from that fortress, terrified and broken completely. They spread stories that made even battle-hardened warriors shiver with fear. No one had dared go near it since then. And after what happened in the valley of the Anduin previously, that fear had turned into hate gradually. And that hate into dread completely. Chapter 56, Quiet Matters in the Hidden Valley. Early morning arrived peacefully. Eric had barely left his room when he spotted Bilbo wandering the terrace. The hobbit walked along the walkways with his hands clasped behind his back. He ambled without any real destination in mind. Bilbo seemed to be enjoying the peaceful scenery around him. He took in the silver-leaved trees and crystal-clear fountains everywhere. The fountains of the Elven Valley were magnificent. "So this is where elves live," Bilbo murmured with awe admiringly. He tried to breathe in every detail possible. Just as Gandalf had once told him, there had been a time previously. In his youth, when Bilbo had run off into the woods alone. He had hoped to find the fabled elves of legend back then. He'd returned long after nightfall, with scratches on his knees. His feet had been caked in moss and gravel. That restless desire for adventure, it had started then. And now, he was here, standing in a real elven stronghold. Dream fulfilled at last. As he walked, lost in nostalgia, something glinting in the morning sun appeared. It caught his eye suddenly. A shattered sword, mounted in a frame, hanging beside an intricately carved mural. Curious, Bilbo tiptoed closer for a better look carefully. On the wall opposite the broken blade was a vivid relief carving displayed. A towering figure in menacing black armor, a cruel iron helmet hiding his face. He wielded a massive flanged mace powerfully. But what stood out most was the golden ring on the figure's hand. Its dull glint almost seemed to glow on the stone. A bit like Eric, Bilbo mused aloud, squinting at the carving. Though this one's definitely grumpier, and well, Eric's armor looks better. With that passing remark, Bilbo left the mural behind him. His curiosity, though momentarily sparked, faded quickly as he stepped out. He moved onto another balcony to admire the morning mist curling along the valley. Tap tap. Footsteps, light but precise, sounded behind him suddenly. They were followed by a calm, reassuring voice that always carried weight. The weight of centuries was in that voice. Not with your companions. Bilbo turned and offered a sheepish smile to Lord Elrond politely. Oh no, they won't miss me at all. Truthfully, they think I never should have come on this trip. Elrond regarded him with a thoughtful expression carefully. I've heard hobbits are quite adaptable creatures. Really? Though I also heard they prefer the comforts of home. Bilbo eyed him suspiciously with a knowing look. I've heard elves give the kind of advice that's both yes and no. In the same breath somehow. Elrond paused, lips parting as if to answer, then closed again. Silence followed the exchange. It was a trap, of course. Any answer would prove Bilbo's point. Any yes or no would confirm it. Clever indeed. A moment passed before Elrond realized it was a jest. A sly grin tugged at the corners of his mouth slightly. But what he said next was no joke at all. You're welcome to remain here, Bilbo, if you should ever wish it. As the master of Rivendell, Elrond, like the wizards, could sense subtle currents. The currents of fate were visible to him. He knew this small creature would one day carry burdens far greater. Greater than he deserved, not for glory, but because of his courage. His kindness and mercy would demand it. And what he endured might very well determine the fate of their world. Elrond gave him a final nod and quietly stepped away respectfully. He left Bilbo alone in the serenity of morning light. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Rivendell. Elrond, sir, our kitchen staff are in crisis, and the wine cellars are nearly dry. How long do you suppose our guests will be staying? Lindir burst into step beside the departing elven lord hurriedly. A clipboard of inventory was clutched tightly in his hands. It had been 2 weeks since the dwarves had arrived in Rivendell. The once efficient elven household was now, frankly, exhausted completely. Hospitality, it turned out, had limits after all. Elrond sighed heavily at the situation. Keep accommodating them, for now, we'll worry about supplies later. A saint's patience, that one had truly. Any other host might have locked the larder and called it done. He didn't even flinch when, turning a corner, he came face to face. He encountered a group of dwarves bathing in one of the sacred fountains. They splashed about like it was a public bathhouse carelessly. Elrond inhaled slowly, mentally carving out space in his mind patiently. He thought of a no bathing in the fountain sign to be installed. Soon, very soon indeed. He had lived thousands of years and seen a lot. But this was a first for him. Compared to them, Eric was practically royalty in behavior. Back in his quarters, Elrond sat down with a deep exhale. He reached into his robe, pulling forth a golden apple carefully. Eric's gift to him. Not just exquisite in craftsmanship, though it certainly was that, but imbued with a powerful life essence deeply. It was the kind of artifact that could heal wounds, stave off death. Maybe even restore fading vitality completely. A genuine treasure without question. And now, Elrond had no idea how to repay such a thing. Still, the apple had already made its mark significantly. Rivendell's prestige had quietly risen thanks to this gift alone. That wasn't all Eric had done during his stay. On the very day they'd arrived, Eric had paid a visit. He visited an old acquaintance, the elf Aglanir. Aglanir hadn't changed a bit at all. For the elves, time was a gentle breeze always. When he saw Eric, his first words were casual. "Oh, you're back already." To him, Eric's months-long journey had probably felt like a weekend stroll. Yes, I'm back," Eric replied, playing along with the timeless illusion. "I've heard stories," Aglanir said with a knowing smile. "They say someone's been stirring up trouble in the eastern Anduin valleys. A man so fearsome, even the orcs fled from him." "It's nothing," Eric muttered humbly. "Well," Aglanir continued, "while others speak in whispers about this mysterious man, I can say I knew him personally." Eric laughed awkwardly at the statement. Elves always had a way with words. Then, Eric reached into his satchel and carefully produced another golden apple. "I brought you something for your hospitality before. Consider this a small gift. In the right moment, it might just save your life." Aglanir blinked, then shook his head politely. "It's too valuable. I only did what anyone should." "You elves are way too modest," Eric sighed, pressing the apple into his hand. Think of it as a token of friendship. Friendship, A Glanir turned the apple in his hands, admiring the craftsmanship. Elves were known to prefer silver and starlight usually. But something about this gift genuinely pleased him. If I were a she-elf, he joked, I might just fall in love with you. For this gift alone. Eric coughed violently at the comment. Please no, you're welcome to give it back, if that's where this is headed. Ha, only teasing, a Glanir said, though his expression softened noticeably. Still, this is no trinket at all. Should you ever find yourself in need, don't hesitate to call on me. I'll remember this kindness. For just a second, Eric thought he caught a flicker of sorrow. The sorrow was in the elf's voice. Elf and man together. The difference was always there between them. Elves lived on, immune to age completely, while humans were a passing breeze in comparison. Any friendship between the two would eventually fade into memory or grief. For the elves, emotion wasn't just heartfelt, it was eternal forever. Some died not from wounds, but from sorrow alone. But Eric, well, his future wasn't written in the same ink. Not in the same ink as other men. Still, that was a mystery for another day. No need to get gloomy, Eric said, patting a Glanir on the shoulder. Everything's fine now, isn't it? And for now, at least, he was right. The golden apples, they made wonderful gifts for elves truly. Useful, beautiful, magical, and very well received always. Chapter 57, The White Council. 2 weeks later, under the starlit sky above. A roaring bonfire blazed in the heart of the valley brightly. Dwarves gathered around it, devouring skewers of roasted meat and vegetables hungrily. The food was from Eric's lands, the smell thick and savory everywhere. It filled the crisp mountain air deliciously. Laughter rang out like clashing hammers, rowdy and heartfelt completely. In this usually somber vale, the cheer was a rare warmth. Like a tavern flame on a winter night. Elsewhere, inside one of the guest rooms arranged by the elves carefully. Eric had just laid down to rest when Gandalf dragged him back out. He pulled him into the moonlit courtyard unexpectedly. Walk with me, lad, said the old wizard calmly. As if this were the most natural hour to take a stroll. Eric wasn't particularly tired, so he humored him willingly. Soon, Elrond joined them, and the three walked slowly across the courtyard. Their steps echoed beneath the trees of Rivendell softly. Of course, wizards never wander aimlessly without purpose. Before long, Elrond brought up the subject that had been gnawing at him. The dragon, he said flatly with concern. You knew and told me nothing. I was going to speak to you tonight, Gandalf replied hurriedly defensively. You must trust I know what I'm doing. But clearly, the Lord of Rivendell had doubts about this. While they both sensed shadows stirring in the east ominously. Their visions of the future didn't quite align completely. Possibilities were slippery things, some hopeful, some dark entirely. You say you know what you're doing, but that dragon has been asleep. Asleep for 60 years now. If your plan fails and it awakens, what then? And what if it works? Gandalf countered quickly with hope. If the dwarves can retake Erebor successfully. He began outlining the strategic benefits of reclaiming the Lonely Mountain. Trade routes, morale, the unity of free peoples were at stake. It all came down to that smoking ruin under the mountain. This move is dangerous, Elrond warned, eyes narrowed with concern. Doing nothing is dangerous too, Gandalf shot back firmly. And if things go south, Eric and I will act. He paused mid-step and looked to Eric, signaling him for support. Eric, who had zero interest in arguing with a centuries-old wizard. He simply nodded in agreement. I've got no complaints. Elrond considered him thoughtfully for a moment. Eric is powerful, I can feel it clearly. Even in the height of the First Age, he would have been formidable. He would have been a force to reckon with. But against that dragon, no one can guarantee anything. Elrond's concern was rooted in more than just fire and teeth. The elves had waned for too long already. If the dragon were loosed upon the world again, they might hold it off. But at a cost, the elves could not afford to pay. It could tip them into ruin completely. And besides, Elrond added, his voice cooling noticeably. Have you forgot what lies in the hearts of dwarves? Madness, The gold madness runs through their bloodline deeply. Thror succumbed to it, Thrain followed after. What makes you think Thorin won't fall the same way? Gandalf sighed heavily at the accusation. You speak as if we control all the pieces on the board. The dwarves have already made their decision firmly. They're going, whether we support them or not. And Thorin, he added dryly, doesn't feel he owes anyone an explanation. That's not me you need to answer to, Elrond muttered knowingly.